Hey everyone, we're reviewing a video by Abbas and the reasons that he believes in Islam. And I've got a couple of heavy hitters with me here today to help with this. So we have Rob and Stopspamming. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Thanks so much.
Hello, hello, hello. Good to be here. It's such fun to be back in the old chair here.
Yeah, it's great to have you both on here. So I think we're just going to jump straight into it. According to the video, Abbas is talking to an ex-Sikh, but I don't think that really matters. So let's get this started. Let's go.
Now, hang on. I haven't been around for like a year or two even. Do you still have all the old names? Hasn't anybody has there been a rejuvenation? Are there any new people on here, or is it still the same people?
There is, I suppose there are, but a lot of the names you'll know. I mean, obviously Hijab is still around, Ali Dawah. I think Smile to Jannah is probably a newer one. He's kind of made it big, but yeah, the names that you know, Imran, Abbas, Mansour, yeah,
They're still doing the same old
yeah,
stuff.
they're still out pumping out the propaganda. So yeah, I think a lot of the names you're going to find are
Okay, well, let's jump in. I was just flabbergasted. No, actually, I was gobsmacked because I couldn't believe when you said Abbas. I thought, come on, there must be new people out by now.
Oh no, same old dogs. Right, should we get going?
Get it.
Right,
Go.
Let's do it.
Slavery, Prophet ﷺ marrying Zainab, the age of Aisha. None of that changes the reality of whether God exists. None of that changes the reality of whether the Quran is from Allah. None of that changes the reality of whether the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the messenger of Allah. Because he comes to you.
right. I'm stopping it there just to say, yeah, technically he's right, but it would change the nature of Islam in terms of how moral the religion is and how moral Muhammad is as the prophet, if these things are true. So yes, it doesn't in itself cancel out Islam being the true religion, all these moral problems, but it certainly calls under question the character of somebody like Muhammad. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, you would not be considered to be an idol today.
Well, I go further than both of you, actually, because I've got I think, fairly robust special version, if you like, of the logical problem of evil. And I'm quite familiar with it now. And I think if there is actual evil and there's certain other entailments that a theist accepts, then God cannot exist. But it's not something I would go through now, but I would have to ask certain questions to see whether the theist accepts that. So depending on a theist, if there is evil, or you can show Muhammad or anybody else was evil, or that actual evil existed by the theist's own lights, then it would follow under certain circumstances that God doesn't exist. But that's something I would do for another day.
Yeah, fair enough. I'll carry on.
With a miracle, which is the Quran, which I believe is objectively, you can objectively challenge the parameters, the concepts, and come to a conclusion that this is not the work of any human being.
Okay, before I get to one...
There you can stop, because this is absolutely ridiculous, because this does not show that there's a God behind it. Just because you use some fancy words, just because you've done poetry or prose or whatever, and you mix them and you've managed to rhyme a couple of words, does not mean that it necessarily has to originate from a God. So this is absolute nonsense. There is no way that you can objectively go and evaluate any piece of art. Its beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, and that's it. And just because somebody can put together a couple of letters to form a word, and a couple of words to form a sentence, a couple of sentences to form a book, does not mean that it doesn't matter how well it's written, doesn't mean that it must come from a God. I mean, that is the most ridiculous argument that they ever come up with.
Yeah, and while none of us are Arabic speakers, I'm sure we've all spoken to plenty of Arab speakers who say this is not an impressive work. You know, there's grammatical problems with it. There's repetition. I mean, even from reading it in English, we know it just jumps randomly from topic to topic. There are completely incoherent parts to it. So
I just finished a video today where I go and I counted, like, I don't know how many personal pronouns they change within just a couple of sentences. It's absolutely ridiculous how God speaks of me, I, we, and then speaks of Allah will do this, third person, whatever, singular, as somebody else. It's ridiculous how bad this book is written.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could probably do 3 hours just on all the problems with the way that the Quran
Yeah,
is written.
exactly. So this is the most stupid argument that they can think of.
Shall I carry on?
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of those objectives. Let me just ask you one more general question about. Well, I got 2 questions. One is about animals. What's the role of animals in Islam? I've been told different things. One, firstly, is it not cruel to just create them just for us to use, kill by slitting their throats? And secondly, do they have souls and do they go to heaven?
So animals have been created, Allah says, because some are to ride, some are to eat,
Right.
and some are just beauty. Allah has just scattered them for beauty.
Yeah. So is it not?
I don't know where he's getting that from. I don't know if you guys know. Is that actually in the Quran, or is he maybe referring to Hadith? I didn't actually check this or not. But
No, this is not in the Quran.
Yeah, I
No, I
didn't think
didn't
so
think-
either. He's just inferring something, right? Maybe from some other secondary or tertiary literature,
Yeah.
but it's not stated as far as I can remember. And this is what they do, right? That's that statement. You probably know that one, Drastic, quite well from a certain Dart Dawkins. But they're just going to infer whatever they want. And I've kind of stopped doing the let's critique the sentences, right? The particular verses, because they're going to have an interpretation of whatever verse, and we're going to have another one. And it's very rare that we're going to have a meeting of the minds on like an interpretation of the verses. So he's just inferring something about this here. What else can you say about this? If there was a clear verse that said, hey, the animals are you're supposed to do X and Y with them. Now they're going to say, they're probably going to infer some general principle that might be said about the world or about other people or living creatures maybe, but I'm not aware of a specific one.
Well, what they're trying to do is that they're taking a fact, a concept, and then shining the light so that the shadows then match up with their sort of projection of what they think a god is. So it's just the fact that you have animals, and now they're saying, well, we have different animals with different things that we can do with them, so God must have intended them that way. And that's it. So it's just backward thinking.
yeah, and I noticed as well, he didn't actually answer the question. He was asked specifically, do animals have souls? And he kind of jumps over it. And I don't, unless I've misremembered this, I don't think he actually answers the question. And I think he was asked specifically about that, I would imagine, because if you're going to say the soul is important, then you need to treat animals well. And I think he just seems to have jumped over that because it brings up a certain kind of moral quandary if you're going to be doing things like halal slaughter and stuff like that. So
I think in Islam, animals generally don't have souls because they're not human. Humans are privileged in as much as Allah says that every soul, which means every human being, has a certain sort of role in life, and the soul will be tested and the soul will taste this. So it's the soul at the end of the day that gets injected into the baby and is then going to go into the afterlife. So I don't think animals have this.
right, okay, should we carry on?
Yeah.
Right. So now again, the question is it cruel
Yeah.
to kill an animal and then consume it?
Considering he could have created us, to not do that. It would
Yeah.
have been.
Okay, things could have just magically appeared, I suppose, come into existence, right?
Well, no, it's not just that they could magically appear. I mean, for example, we've got plenty of examples of organisms that don't need to predate on each other. I mean, this is something that I've discussed in detail with Skydive Phil, who really does this argument well. But there's no need, even by basic evolutionary standards, to have animals kill each other. You can have photosynthesis to gain energy directly from the sun. So
Correct. Yeah.
it is a real moral issue here. Why has Allah supposedly set it up in this way, which is not necessary for all the additional pain and suffering that goes along with it? Why do it that way when you don't have to?
Yeah, no, he probably won't say it himself, but one reason they try to do is soul building. There is actually an interesting argument about animals. I actually do think that the animal suffering is a very good reason in favor of the evidential problem of evil. But one of the things that is typically said, and an extraordinary one that, of course, he wouldn't be aware of, but it essentially is like an appeal to a miracle. I just happened to come across this paper by a philosopher in Birmingham somewhere, a theist, Christian philosopher. And the idea is that there's soul building. But it's obviously not the building of the soul of the animal. It's the building of the soul of the human. But this rather unique approach to it, which he doesn't use, this guy, he wouldn't know how to use this, is that there's no unseen suffering. So the only suffering that actually happens is in the presence, visual presence of any human being. Everything else, the animals actually don't suffer. But ultimately what this seems to my mind appeal to is like a miracle. Because if you think animals do suffer, then in order for them not to suffer, how would they know when there's no human being that would ever be in sight of them? Because they wouldn't necessarily be able to have the awareness, right? If you were a mile away looking with binoculars, they would not know that your presence was there. So it seems to me the only way you could suggest that they wouldn't suffer is if there was a divine onlooker. But then you just appeal to a miracle. And of course, appealing to a miracle can solve anything. But that's not going to be impressive to anybody who doesn't already believe either in miracles or, and it's intellectually lazy, because, you know, you're not really going to want to appeal to a miracle to answer something when specifically it appears to be some sort of natural event. So, you know, just invoking that God's going to step in to solve this wouldn't work. So soul building could be an alternative, but it's very rare, and I just don't think that works with animal suffering anyway.
Yeah, I'd agree.
The point here is Allah created them for a purpose and a reason, and Allah gave us the best way of accomplishing that goal by sacrificing them in a particular way.
Stop there
Now,
for a second.
somebody might say,
What's this accomplishing the goal there? What is it the goal? What's the goal that they're supposed to accomplish? What, eating it? He's unclear about what the goal is supposed to be there. So he's given them animals to accomplish this goal in the best way. That's like rhetorical language, right? He's not clear what the goal is and what this best way is supposed to be.
Well, some for riding, some for eating, some for beauty. So they have different goals, different concepts.
I mean, actually, I wanted to go back to that because his explanation of all those different things. Okay, there's a handful of animals that can be ridden. There's a handful of animals that look beautiful. I can't remember what the third one was. And for eating, but there are millions of different species of insects that don't really fulfill any of those criteria. So what's the point of them? And you can say that about a lot of other animals. So I think his reasoning is full of holes.
Well, they're food for the other animals, like a mosquito. Well, a bird eats a mosquito, and a bird gives you a certain function where it distributes seeds of something while it shits, and therefore this benefits the human. So you can build like a whole, like a daisy chain of functions and causalities.
But what about
it
all
just
those
seems unnecessarily complex, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Where
it does.
These things could have been distributed. So you go through all of this sort of, which is what we would expect under an evolutionary model. We just,
correct.
It's not clear that you would expect this under the God hypothesis, this sort of rather complex, convoluted way of quite doing these things.
And that's why I always use. That's why I always use the example of the sand wasp, where I always ask, if I were God, don't you think if you were God, you could find a better way of feeding your larvae than depositing them inside another living being?
Yeah.
This needless suffering. This is always something that I point out, and this is no theist can answer that.
Yeah, and also all the diseases which cause human beings an awful lot of suffering. What's the point of those?
Yeah, what's the point of a virus? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if
but
you're
the other
setting...
thing that's no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if you're setting up the rules for life, you don't need to put diseases in. So, yeah, I just can't see the point of that. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think with the animal thing, one of the questions, if you are going to go down this route, the very first question to ask somebody, because it'll entail, the subsequent sort of direction the conversation takes, and that is whether they think that animals can suffer in the same way that humans can. If the answer is yes, and it's typically called higher level first order pain or first order experience of pain, if they do, that's extremely problematic for them. Because if animals can suffer, then you're right. Because the animals can't, their souls can't be built, the typical theodicies can't be employed, unless you use that one that I mentioned, but then you're kind of appealing to a miracle, and that's not going to be impressive in philosophy to appeal to a miracle. Then it seems to me you're in in a very tough position to explain this, which is why somebody like William Lane Craig does not think that animals experience first order pain. He thinks they experience second order pain, which is the idea that they mimic the pain. It's like when you go to the doctor and they hit you just below the knee, your leg just automatically flicks out. You can't stop it. And so second order pain is, well, whatever's happening, let's say they were being burnt on the stake like they used to in the Dark Ages or whatever it might be. The animal isn't experiencing the pain. It's just like the body's just reacting like you've been hit below the knee. Now, of course, I think there's very good evidence, and that's what Scott Phil's paper points towards, that they do experience first order pain. But if they did try and go down that route where they don't experience any sort of pain, I think that's the only way that they could try and get away with this. But I think you'd have to ask them, and most people who don't know any better are going to say, well, yeah, it does seem like animals experience first order pain. They do everything, they scream, they do all of those things. But a sophisticated interlocutor like Craig was a guy, but that's also consistent with them experiencing second order pain. But then you can go to like MRICs and various other empirical data. And if he's just going to say, but then the question for him is, well, how can you differentiate? You want to make the claim that it's second order pain, but it's also consistent with first order pain. So there's got to be something that differentiates first and second order pain. Sorry for the details there, but that's important. If they're going to, you just got to get them to agree that animals suffer in the same way as humans. Then I think you've got a strong argument in favor of the evidential problem of evil.
Right, I'll carry on.
But it's very cruel. I see a lamb being slaughtered. It's perfectly natural for you or for I to feel averse because we have, compassion in our hearts, and we have, we're sensitive beings generally.
But why would that be the case? I mean,
exactly. Good question.
I mean, because if this is the right way, this is God's way to do it, then why would he also put these feelings of compassion where you're thinking, isn't that a cruel act? If this is God's way, it should just be, oh no, this is fine. This is either it's not real pain or this is just part of God's plan, so why should I care? So I think the natural sympathetic response we have is evidence against their position.
Well, I think what he could ask there is, well, why do you have this natural aversion, right? Would you have a natural aversion if a robot, if you started chopping off or pulling apart a robot's arms or whatever? Most people will say no. So why is it that you have this natural aversion? And if he's intellectually honest, he would say, well, because I think that animals can suffer like we can. Once he says that, now we're in a very strong position, right? So he should have asked the other person. But of course, they typically pick some of these things where they don't have good interlocutors, and it just allows the Muslim to, lecture the other guy. Because I did watch this, if I remember. This guy doesn't say very much, but I would have asked, okay, why do we feel that? Oh, so you are agreeing that animals feel pain in the same way we do, right? And then you would have to say yes.
They never think of consequences. This is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, this video is fairly typical of the, I think it's EF Dawah. They put out these conversations where it is almost a monologue, as you say. The interlocutors don't really challenge them, which is one of the reasons that I picked this video, because I thought there's a lot of things that do need to be challenged that weren't. So it needed our special treatment of it. So carry on?
Yep.
But there may be things that you or I will witness and see that may seem very harsh. They may seem difficult to fathom. But it's again because of our perspective of how we see things and how we look at things. So, for example,
same question.
If you see a man cutting open a woman, you know nothing about surgery. You might think, what a horrible thing that man has just done. He's got a sharp instrument and he's just opened up the whole belly of this woman. But then when the surgeon explains to you, I've just had to do an emergency cesarean section, I had to bring the baby out, otherwise the mother would have died and the baby would have died.
Yeah, I'm pausing it there because this is just a great example of the absolute piss poor analogies that they always do, these Dawah apologists, because the whole point is that, yes, you've got the surgeon there to explain to you, this is not without reason. There is a good reason to be doing this act, which on the surface might appear an act of cruelty. No, it's actually to help the person. So, and the point is that, as we're about to get into, the halal slaughter, there is no good reason that I've ever heard for why you need to do it that way. even if you accept the argument that it's okay for human beings to eat animals, and obviously vegetarians and vegans would argue against that, but assuming that in itself is not a moral issue, still a moral issue of how much suffering you're going to cause. And so therefore this analogy is dreadful, because this situation has a good reason. The halal slaughter doesn't, as far as I can see.
Come on, Rob, what's your favorite word?
Oh, goodness, I don't remember now. What's my favorite word?
Disanalogous.
Disanalogous, you're absolutely right. Well, there's two reasons why. And you did hit the nail on the head there, Drastic. There's two reasons why what he said here is actually very poor. The first thing is that he said earlier there, well, we don't have the perspective, right? We might... What appears to us to be evil might in fact not be evil, is kind of what he's saying, because God has got this global perspective. The problem with saying that is it's called something called skeptical theism, right? What seems evil to us, God has got a good reason to do it, but we just don't have the cognitive ability to assess or to access what that good reason is. Now, that's an extremely problematic view, because you can say that for anything, and it seems like it's an escape, but actually it's not. And I won't go into the details here and now, but to appeal to skeptical theism is a really bad idea. But then the analogy was, in fact, not skeptical theism, but in fact that you were able to access, in the analogy, the surgeon. Well, we can't access God, but you can access the surgeon, as you pointed out, and he can tell you now you can go, what you might have thought was bad is in fact good. Now, all we need to do is for God to tell us how it is that with animals suffering, that's a good thing, right? Especially if it's an animal on animal, or in the tar pits, as Skydive Phil points out, where they would die horribly in the tar pits, and other animals would see them helpless there and go, there's an easy meal. They'd get caught in the tar pits and also die. And so you'd have hundreds, if not thousands, of animal skeletons in these tar pits, where it was like just a natural death trap.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now God has to explain what that is, so that we as rational human beings go, like the surgeon, I see now why this is a good thing. I thought it was bad, but now I see why it's good. And until you can do that, it's the analogy doesn't work, and B, if you can't do that, then you're appealing to skeptical theism. Both of these are very bad ways to go. So disanalogous and appealing to skeptical theism in the beginning.
And the thing is, it's always the same thing. We see the pixel, God sees the picture.
And I mean, I've done now dozens and dozens of review videos, and I know you guys have probably done hundreds in your time. I've still never come across a Muslim apologist who has effectively employed an analogy every time.
You're right.
Every single time without fail, they fail.
Yeah.
It's appalling.
Yeah, and normally you appeal to analogy when somebody doesn't know how, doesn't seem to understand. Then you go, okay, let me argue by analogy so you can see what it is. Because you can argue by analogy, but it's typically employed when somebody doesn't understand. But as you both quite rightly point out, 99 times out of 100, and that's being charitable, it's disanalogous in some way. And the way I've learned from some of my more smart colleagues on Clubhouse is you just ask them, what's the analogous property? That's the correct question, as I understand it philosophically, to say, what's the analogous property here? Now, you might have to explain what that means. It simply means, okay, so when you're using this analogy, how does the surgeon, is that the analogous property? Okay, now how is that analogous with God? Because God isn't there to explain why that we see the suffering, right? Whereas the surgeon is there to explain why it is that he was chopping somebody or slicing somebody open, right? So that's why it's disanalogous.
This is the irony, though, because an analogy its function is to clarify something, and yet every time a Muslim apologist uses an analogy, it brings more confusion. So it just doesn't.
It's so true. So true. Yeah.
Shall I carry on?
Yep.
Now your perspective has changed.
Yeah.
The act was exactly the same.
But here we know the reason is for us to use them or eat. To eat them, right?
Yes.
So we know the reason.
Yes.
It's just it seems odd that
We know the reason,
yeah.
but it's the mechanism that we're not happy about. And I'm saying that mechanism might be something that your perception is averse to, is against. But I would say, for me, if there's a good reason to believe in God, if the Quran is from God, and if Allah says this is how I have done things, and this is the right way, the good way, the correct way, then my perspective has to change.
Yeah.
That thing can't be bad.
stop it there.
Yeah, I was just going to stop
why?
it myself anyway. But you go ahead, Rob. Go ahead.
You go ahead first. No, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say. I mean, this for me is just an open acknowledgement that he's just following divine command theory. He doesn't actually care about the moral issue fundamentally. It's just if it comes from God, it has to be good. So therefore, for me, it's almost an amoral position to take. He's not thinking about it. He's not trying to determine whether this is right or wrong. It's the question's already answered for him, and I just think it's appalling. But you go ahead.
Stops. You want to say?
No, same thing.
Okay. Yeah. So I think when you start to do what he's doing here, again, you're appealing to skeptical theism, but you're assuming that it's good. But actually, what you want to find out, is it good, and how do I explain it to myself and to somebody who's skeptical? Because if you're a vegan, or indeed you're somebody who thinks that this is needlessly, there is some needless suffering of animals here, you cannot just say, well, I think this is the case, that because I believe the book and I believe God is good. But he's not giving me the reason. And in a sense, it's like if this is a problem, and God knows this will be a problem, presumably, for his creation, then he's actually obligated, I'm going to use the strong word obligated here, to actually provide the reason. Because if he doesn't, there's a high probability that some people will not accept either the religion or that it's God, because now you have a fact that's unexplained that to us seems to be needless suffering. Now, if you could explain it in some way, like the surgeon analogy, well, then you might be able to do this. And that's what theologians have tried to do. They've tried to offer human explanations to fill in the gap here. But especially with animals, none of those, in my view, actually works. And so what he's doing is motivated reasoning. And he's like you I think, were saying as well, it's like, stop thinking here. I'm just going to accept that it's the case, because if I think God is good, and I think he exists, well, then everything he does is good. And when something conflicts with my intuition, well, I'm just going to have to ignore my intuition. But if you're going to ignore your intuition, you can't then appeal to your intuition at a later date, because now you're going to be inconsistent. Now you're going to be hypocritical. So if you were to say, all you'd be left with now is justifying, well, because God says so. Well, how do we know that what God says is good, right? That was the key question that was asked of Hijab. If you guys remember that famous video where he just had a brain fart and wasn't able to answer, right? How does God know what God knows is good? I'll never forget that question that guy asked him, and he just imploded. And it's the same question that you'd ask Abbas here. How do you know that what God knows, or how does God know that what God knows is good?
Yeah.
It can only be good.
Okay.
But my perspective is what's at fault here. My perspective is what has a problem here. But there are certain things that we're not permitted to do. So when you slaughter the animal, the knife has to be very sharp. Yeah. I just wanted to say a big thank you.
I'll just stop it here. Just fast forward. Yeah, forward through this a little bit. While you do that, but now, did you hear what he said there? He's now, like, in a sense, he's contradicted himself, because previously he said, like, my perspective has to change. But now he's claiming that his perspective is correct. That is, the knife has to be sharp. How does he know that that's the correct perspective? You see, this is the problem with, on one hand, saying, well, my perspective has to change. On what basis are you changing it? Well, because God says so. Well, where does God say that you have to use a sharp knife, for example? And how do you know that perspective, that you've got the right perspective there? And so I think
you're applying human evaluation here, not a divine one.
Exactly. The way to be consistent is just to say, I'm not even going to rely on my perspective at all here. I'm just going to follow blindly like a sheep whatever God says. Then you're going to be consistent. But as long as you bring your perspective in, either you're going to be inconsistent here, or you really shouldn't do it, because you're only going to bring it in when it suits you and it matches what God says. Because you see there, he was quite happy to eject his perspective when it seemed like there was unnecessary suffering for animals and he didn't have an explanation. Well, God's got some reason for it. It disagrees with my perception. I'll just jettison my perception.
The whole thing is illogical in my eyes.
Right, let's carry on.
So sharp that you reach the back of the spinal cord within just 3 strokes. So it's less than a second.
Okay, that's nonsense, by the way.
As soon as the jugular
just stop it there, just quickly. I did look at this sort of claims that he made. This was a couple of years back, well, more than a couple now, 4 or 5 years ago. And this isn't actually the case. Right, the animals suffer even with halal slaughter for at least up to 2 minutes. Can be shorter, but it can be up to 2 minutes, no matter how good the knife and all that sort of stuff is. I know somebody who has got a quote-unquote ethical Muslim farm where they do this sort of stuff, and they have tested animals, and they've tested it under other scenarios as well. So stunning is, as far as I can tell, when we looked at it, is one of the quickest ways to do it. If you are going to eat animals, then you want to stun them, because then they're unconscious very, very quickly, and then there's no suffering, or very little, or minimized suffering. But with halal slaughter, it's not the most economical way if you want to avoid suffering. So the claim that he wants to make that they're out in 1 second is just nonsense.
Well, the emotional suffering is the same, because you are taking an animal out of its normal habitat, and you are now putting it in a situation which is stress for the animal. And it doesn't matter what you're going to do, whether you're going to stun it or whether you're going to slit the throat, it's always something unusual for the animal itself. So there's always stress.
That's right. And I think there's a view that animals can kind of sense when they're going to a slaughterhouse and stuff as well, because they've got
something
enhanced
unusual,
senses and so forth. Exactly. So they know that there's something there that's not good. And as you say, before they even get into the slaughterhouse, they're in the cart going through the whole thing. I haven't actually watched it. It's probably too horrific to watch, although I have seen some of it, unfortunately. I think they already sense it there. So as you say, they have these stress-related reactions to it already. And that, I think, is a form of suffering as well.
It's like when you take a dog to the vet. They know that they're going to the vet.
That's right.
Right, I'll carry on.
There's a massive blood pressure drop in the brain.
Oh, bullshit.
And the animal goes through a form of being semi-conscious.
Yeah, semi-conscious
How
is
the
still
fuck do you
conscious,
know?
though. So there is, from what I've looked into on this, they are still suffering pain. There's no evidence that I've seen that suggests that all pain, all the pain sensors are now inactive.
Well, he just said it himself, semi-conscious. If you're semi-conscious, you will still experience pain. So he's just contradicting himself again.
Yeah.
And what you'll find is that...
Stop there just a second. I just want to point something out. You know it as well, Stops.
What, the body language?
Yeah, exactly right. When you've been doing this, and you have now as well, Drastic, do you see his face there? What's going on? He's making shit up here, and you can see it on his face, right?
Yeah,
that's like
I
contortion, right? We all picked it up, right? Just for people who are watching this later on, all of us picked this up, right? It's like, what am I going to say next? What am I going to come up with next say? Right? Exactly.
Yeah. He knows he's talking absolute fucking garbage. I mean, that's the truth of it. But it's almost like he feels the need to go through this process first, and then the next bit is really telling, because it's almost like, oh, it doesn't even matter either way, though. So this is just like a nonsense preamble. Let's carry on.
A lot of those pain sensory nerves behind the jugular are severed. And so what you might perceive to be great suffering may be a very swift death.
I will need to look in.
Yeah, might be, but actually isn't. So, yeah.
Yeah, the evidence isn't there. There's empirical evidence against that. So his claim here. But notice what happens, right? He says it with an air of authority. And if you're not like one of us who are quite familiar with these guys, you might go, this guy knows what he's talking about. That's how they get away with this, especially with a gullible Muslim audience. But even with non-Muslims who don't know any better, they sound like they know what they're talking about. And oftentimes somebody perhaps like on the other side there will go, oh, I'll have to look into this, right? Because you take it that the guy seems to know what he's talking about. You're not sure, but with the rest of us who not only know him, but just in general, why would we take this? My first thing is like, what's your empirical evidence for that? Or are you just supposing that's the case?
Right. What is the way that mercy killings are performed? What is the way that prisoners are executed in different countries where you still have the death sentence? How do you commit suicide? You don't go and get somebody, how you slit your throat or something. Come on, this is ridiculous.
That's a great point, actually, Stops, because I've said this previously when I've argued with Muslims on this issue, that if you really think that this is the best method, would you be happy to die by it? Would you be happy for one of your families to die by it? Or would you, you don't have like the clinics in Switzerland, I think, where you can go to end your life. They don't cut your throat, do they?
Euthanasia.
They give you barbiturates, which just send you off into a peaceful sleep.
Exactly.
So that really shows that this is absolute nonsense.
But also, I had the unfortunate experience of having to put one of my dogs down, well, the dog we had.
Oh, I remember that, yes.
I told you about it, Stops, didn't I? And but even that process to begin with at the vet, they took the dog away. We were in the parking lot. They took the dog away. It took about 15 minutes, and they came back, and they had attached to his arm a little thing where they'd got into the vein there, and they obviously hadn't done anything. But even that, she told me, we struggled to find the vein. So there was suffering there before they even got to that point. And then we were with the dog, and they first knock the dog out, give it a sedative, knock the dog out, and the very next injection stops the heart, right? So we were there to witness it, and something I'll never forget in my life. But even to get to that position where you could have those two injections, you first have to get the needle or this sort of thing that was sticking out of the dog's, paw into the vein, and that was suffering in and of itself, right? So even going to the vet is suffering under the best conditions that we can do today.
To the halal method of
But brother, my point to you also is this. Let's say, for argument's sake, that the animal did feel pain.
Yeah.
Does that falsify the Quran?
No, but
Does that falsify? What I'm trying to explain to you, why?
Go ahead, Stops, you first. Go.
No, I said yes. Finished. That's it. Of course it does. Because how can you have a God who in first chapter, first sentence says, I am all merciful, all beneficial? You're not. If you allow suffering, it doesn't matter of animals or people or whatever, you are not being those things. Finished. End of.
Certainly, if there's no good reason for it. Certainly, if there's no.
Well, he would need to provide it, right? So the question to him is, if there was suffering and there was no good reason for it, would you agree then that it falsifies the Quran? If he still says no, then we have to go down exactly what you said there, Stops. Is God all merciful? What do you understand by mercy? Is it the case that where you wouldn't require any unnecessary suffering, a merciful God would not have that happen? If he says yes, great. If he says no, now we have to ask him, and I have this a lot on Clubhouse, sometimes with Muslims, sometimes with other theists. What is your understanding of merciful? Now you have to go down, and what sometimes happens, depending on who you're speaking to, they have essentially a definition which we, sort of tongue-in-cheek on the other app called Smurf, it's like Smurfiful, if you like. So you put an S in front of it. So it's like they've redefined the word. It's not merciful anymore. It's like Smurfical or something like that. It's not merciful. Smurfical. Thank you. There we go. I was trying to pronounce it right. It's the same thing with good. You're talking about schmud. It's not good. It's schmud.
Yeah, it's like saying merciful, smurciful, whatever. Yeah,
exactly right. They redefine merciful to mean something that is not common use language, some idiosyncratic definition. And you can point this out. You can highlight it. But you've got to say more than that, because the average layperson who's listening won't know what that means. Oh, Smurf, what does that mean? So you've got to articulate. Well, you're now redefining. Imagine I said, well, pain means giving you a hug. Nobody's going to accept that, right? So you've got to use a really very straightforward example there to show them what they mean by this. Oh, and do you mean, and then you can also check their consistency there. What do you mean by love? Well, how do you know that that's not slapping somebody in the face? Or knifing them in the heart.
My God.
I could call that shmalad, right?
Yeah.
But that's sheer desperation.
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
Correct.
I'm saying these things to you is because, fundamentally, there has to be a hierarchy of importance.
Why?
Yeah.
Again, Allah's got the power to create this system. Why does there have to be this hierarchy of importance in terms of how much pain is going to be suffered? Yeah.
And remember, he says that. Let's say maybe that's the case in Islam, but the way he says this, it's like a universal. No, that doesn't necessarily follow. Why would the person who's listening to him accept that state of affairs? Maybe you believe that in Islam because Allah's at the top, and then it's the humans, and then it's whatever else facilitates, human interactions and so forth. But the person who's listening doesn't have to accept that. So you'd have to present reasons to convince the other person. Otherwise, you're just saying, well, I believe this. Well, who cares what you believe? Why should I believe it?
Exactly, yeah.
What's the hierarchy? Look, it doesn't matter if the halal method is good or bad.
There we have it. There we have it. See, this was the key bit I was waiting for, because I remember he said this. So essentially, everything he's just said has just been chewing up the clock, just wasting people's time, because fundamentally, whether this is the worst thing in the world, he doesn't give a shit. If God ordered it, then it's okay.
Yeah.
So
Look, let's hear a little bit more. I just obviously when I've just heard this now, I'm like, hang on, you're contradicting yourself again. Let's see if he gives an explanation. If not, I'll ask you to stop it, because I think that's a big problem now. Saying, well, if it's not the best, right? Because he made a whole issue about how he wants to think it is the best. Why should it be the best? Because God is all merciful and all good, and therefore He's going to bring about a state of affairs that is the best. But what do we mean by best? In this case, he wanted to say originally that it involves the least amount of suffering, which is slitting the throat, because it's remember originally he said it can happen in 1 second. Do you remember that very vague, now very distant claim that's been forgotten?
Yep. Let me play it on a bit.
According to people. Because if the Quran is not from God, it doesn't matter.
What?
The Quran is not from God.
If Quran is not from God, it's irrelevant of how you kill the animal in terms of whether it's a good or bad thing, right?
Right. No.
What an idiot. He just said the opposite. He just said that the knife has to be sharp, and now he said it says it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and also he's implied that under a world without God, then there's no ethical issue there. There's no moral issue if you haven't got a God. Doesn't matter if there's no God, if there's no Quran. That's absolute garbage. If suffering matters to you, then of course it matters. So you don't need a God for that. So he's wrong on 2 levels there, as far as I can
But notice what happened there. He now shifted the goalposts, right? Because what he was originally arguing for is that Islam is the best, the Quran is true, and the reason that we should employ halal slaughter is because it's the best. But the category error that he's now made is to say, well, in a non-God worldview, it doesn't matter. We're not talking about the non-God worldview. So this is now, and they do this a lot, right? They'll swap between their view and somebody else's view. And if you're paying attention, I don't care what you think about whether if the Quran doesn't exist, it doesn't matter. We're saying that you claiming that the Quran exists and it does matter. Now let's show that, in fact, it is the best way.
Yep. Let's play on.
Right.
If the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is not the Prophet of God,
Right.
it doesn't matter whether he married Zainab or not.
Right.
Totally irrelevant, right? So we can just move on from that.
But also the same mistake. He's essentially saying that without God, there's just no morality anyway, which is false. But let's move on.
Right. It comes back to morality.
It comes back to, is this from God?
Yeah.
Does God exist? Are there good reasons to believe so?
Okay.
And so what I should do as a human being is say, look, you know what? Let me at least accept that which I'm convinced about.
Right.
The other stuff may or may not have an explanation.
Right.
You will find explanations.
What is he convinced about?
But I'm just saying, if you don't find explanations.
Yeah, just stop it there for a moment, Drastic. This is all kind of waffle now. Now he's trying to think of the next thing to say, right? Because the original claim was, hey, I'm going to tell you, because he was asked by the interlocutor. See, this is what happens when, and it can happen very easily, right? Because these guys waffle, you kind of forget the original point. But he was asked to explain about animals and the potential suffering and so forth in the very beginning. And how does he explain this under Islam, right? That's what he was doing. And what he wants to say and what he tried to say in the beginning is now Islam's got the answer. And by answer here, we mean that it has the least amount of suffering. And that's what we would expect from a merciful God. But now he's waffling and he's said, well, if there wasn't a God view, we wouldn't care about this. We're not talking about that. It's not interesting. And this part now is all just waffle. Now he's changing the subject again to say, well, but this is all about whether God is true. But the other guy was saying, well, okay, if God was true, he didn't use those words, but he was essentially saying under Islam, what's your explanation for this? So we're accepting for the sake of the discussion that God does exist under your view. And is this God a merciful God? Right. So this whole thing about does God exist isn't relevant at this stage at all. But this is what they do when they run out of things to say. They go back to, and it's just like a safety net. When I don't know what else I'm going to say here, and I'm tongue tied now. I'm just going to go back and say this is all revolves around whether God exists. No, it doesn't, because we've accepted that God existed in this particular discussion, and now you have to justify that it is in fact the most merciful God, and that halal slaughter is the best way to kill an animal, if indeed we even agree that animals need to be killed.
Rob, let me spin it on for another 20 seconds, because he is actually leading somewhere with this, and it's even worse. So let me just it just keeps getting worse. Let me spin it on for another 20 seconds. You'll see what I mean.
It doesn't falsify the very foundational concepts of those things that you have to believe anyway.
Okay, so let's talk about those then.
So what I would say is that accept Islam, at least, do the shahada at least,
Yeah.
because at least those fundamentals you have no problem with.
But does it count if
Right, see, this is where he was leading. Fundamentally, what he's saying is it doesn't matter that your conscience is telling you there's something wrong here. Just become a Muslim, and then you're already locked in, and you can worry about this stuff later. And so it's encouraging ignorant conversions. They always say, oh, no, we want people to understand the Quran, we want people to understand God. No, it is basically saying, accept this, even though you've got all these problems, and somehow it will just work itself out. It's a dreadful piece of the video.
Go ahead, Stops. You wanted to say something?
No, I was just laughing. I mean, this is ridiculous, really. This is first accept it, first believe, say the Shahada, and then when you're part of in the cult, then everything else will become clear to you. All you need to do is accept Muhammad as your savior, and then you will also accept God, and then you will see the light. Come on.
Yeah, this is extraordinary, right? Because if you claim that you want to convert people for good reasons, but you haven't even backed up under your own view that this is in fact the best way, and then you're quite happy to say, well, under some other view, you wouldn't be able to say whether it's right or wrong. That's obvious nonsense, and that's something else we can talk about. I could say why it's right or wrong about slaughtering animals, because I think that they're conscious, they suffer, and I want to avoid suffering. I think most sentient creatures do, and that's the position I take, and I don't need a God to tell me. So now I've got this position, and I don't think halal is the most economical way if you are going to slaughter animals anyway. So why on earth am I going to accept Islam if it has, by my lights, an immoral concept there, which is halal slaughter? So not only have you not convinced me that Islam is true, but now you're saying, well, as you guys quite rightly pointed out, just accept it, because what happens after you accept something, and maybe he knows this and other people do, what you then try to do is justify your decision. I was speaking to somebody earlier today who accepted Christianity because he was convinced by Darth Dawkins and claimed to be a clear-thinking atheist. And I was like, no, but you're not clear-thinking at all. But what he now wants to do, and this is what he's alluding to, is that then you'll try and justify the decision. Because what you don't want to admit is that you made a bad decision. So instead, you'll try and find reasons to justify the decision to make it appear that it's good. And that's, of course, not critical thinking or a good way to convince somebody.
I think at this point in the video, he moves away from animal suffering, but I think we can all agree he's done a dreadful job in terms of trying to justify this.